Hello, U.S. history class. So we're jumping into Unit 12, and the title of this unit is Truman through Johnson. But I went with this background image because the overarching, really big thing that's going on at this time frame is the Cold War, and the two superpowers of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union. So I plan on this and then one other video. This video, I mean, you'll see what it goes over. Next time will be mainly about the Korean War and some of the stuff involving Cuba during the time of JFK, and then just a little bit into Lyndon Baines Johnson. That's Truman through Johnson here. All right, so let's jump in. So first of all, a little bit about the Iron Curtain. You had a reading question that talked about the term the Iron Curtain, and I forget if your reading question said that, or it was asking whether or not Winston Churchill coined it. Most historians agree that he was not the one who actually coined the term, that someone else came up with it, but he's the one who made it famous by using it in a speech that he gave in Massachusetts, actually. And what he said, and I just quote up here on the top right, is from Stettin in the Baltic. Where that is, let me have my mouse here. That is right about there. It's in modern day Poland. They're on the Baltic Ocean up in here. Um, to Trieste in the Adriatic, and that is kind of right down here. So it's not where this image is showing the Iron Curtain extending, but anyway. Then it continues, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that lies all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and, in many cases, increasing measure of control from Moscow. And he gave that speech on March 5th, 1946. So this map here has this black line here is Iron Curtain there, and then also up here, and then the dark blue, we'll kind of talk about later with a different map, but founding NATO members as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You have Iceland, the United Kingdom, so you have England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Denmark, Spain, Portugal, Italy, okay, places like that. And then later, some other countries who joined NATO that were not in the initial group that formed. Then the Warsaw Pact is the term that's being used here for the Soviet Union, and what another way of putting it are the satellite countries of the Soviet Union. And then Yugoslavia here was socialist, but not aligned with either side. And then a few here that are militarily neutral. So, for example, Switzerland, Czech Republic, Ireland, and a few others. All right, so that's a little bit of what was going on there. In the Iron Curtain, that term was used because to the rest of the world, the Soviet Union was essentially blocked off, closed off, no contact, no communication, and Stalin was kind of keeping things largely in the dark for what life was like and what was going on in the Soviet Union, so the rest of the world wouldn't really know. So that was going on. And then I have a little bit here about FDR and Harry Truman. So this was the 1944 presidential campaign, and FDR was running for his fourth term as president. Now, what happened was George Washington served two terms, and then he announced before the end of his second term that he was not planning to run for reelection. And every president after him, if they had been elected twice, they said, you know what? Two terms was good enough for George Washington. Two terms is good enough for me. And so there never had been a president who would run for a third term as president because just the precedent that George Washington set was making it, practically speaking, a term limit of two terms for the U.S. president. And George Washington did that partially just because he wanted to live and enjoy a nice, quiet kind of retirement at Mount Vernon, but also because he felt like 8 years is long enough for a person to be in the executive position over the United States. But that was the case until FDR. FDR served his second term, and then he ran for reelection, was elected a third time, ran for reelection, was elected a fourth time. But early in his fourth term, he died. And then his vice president, Harry S. Truman, became president. And that relates to the 22nd Amendment. So, what happened was a little while later, Congress and the states decided, you know what, we actually want to stick to a president only serving 2 terms. So, we're actually going to ratify the Constitution, not ratify, amend the Constitution with the 22nd Amendment that will make it so that presidents can only serve 2 terms. There are a few extra details about, like, well, what if a president was was initially the vice president and he only served part of a term? What are the details for whether or not he can still be elected 2 more times, or if he can only be elected 1 more time? And those details are in there as well. Let's see. So Truman, Harry Truman, was president at the beginning of the Cold War. The Cold War extends basically from 1945, when World War II ended, until most count it ending around 1991. So we're talking about a good solid half of a century was the Cold War. And we still have a variety of things that are hanging around from it. For example, you may be familiar with the term a third world country. Like, oh, that's a third world country, which usually people use to refer to a poor or underdeveloped country. But that terminology we still have from Cold War times because at the time, the First World was a way of referring to the United States and its allies. The Second World was a way of referring to the Soviet Union and its allies. And the Third World were the countries that were not really aligned with the United States or the Soviet Union. And usually those were poor, underdeveloped countries. And so that term, third world country, still hangs around today, even though it technically is kind of meaningless because we don't have first world and second world as terms anymore. Similar to biology, I have whatchamacallit, video questions that I'm going to ask here and there. And I'm glancing at them, and nope, not yet. All right, next slide. Also, 1945, we have the United Nations was formed. So the League of Nations, you might recall, was Woodrow Wilson's idea, and it was formed shortly after World War I, and the United States did not join. But then World War II happened, and shortly after World War II, the United Nations was formed. And both the League of Nations and the United Nations are kind of based on this idea of, well, if we can just get countries to talk to each other, to negotiate, to pursue peace with each other, then we can avoid, if not eradicate, war from the world. And it's just based on the idea of really like the intrinsic goodness of man that will surely there's nothing intrinsic in people that would cause war to happen. It's just misunderstandings and miscommunication and a lack of an opportunity to get together and to talk about stuff. And that's kind of what the United Nations is based on as well. I have on the left here, this is some official stuff from the United Nations, and it lists here peace and security, sustainable development, human rights, humanitarian assistance. And I have here founded in 1945, a little bit about the Security Council. So this talks about the Security Council as well. The Security Council is made up of a total of 15 member countries, and there are 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members. The 5 permanent members are United States, Russia, or at the time of its founding, the Soviet Union, China, France, and the UK. And then the 5 non-permanent members, they serve 2-year terms basically, and they're kind of on a rotating basis, but looking for representatives from Africa, Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, Western Europe, and Eastern Europe. And this is the room where the Security Council meets. And one of the things that ended up being kind of problematic with how the Security Council was set up was that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council had veto power. And so, if there was some resolution that the United Nations was considering, any one of the 5 permanent members could veto that resolution, that decision, and could make it not happen. And during the Cold War, when both Russia and China, or Soviet Union and China, were communists and engaged in the Cold War against the United States, and kind of the UK and France. It was kind of problematic from an organizational standpoint that you had opposing groups like that as members of the Security Council. I mentioned 51 then, 193 now. What this refers to is it refers to how many member countries there are. When the UN was established in 1945, there were 51 countries who joined, and now there are a total of 193 countries that are members of it. So the vast majority of countries in the world are members of the United Nations. This pie chart here is about the budget, United Nations regular budget assessment. So there's a regular budget and there are extra budgets on top of the regular budget. But so check it out. The United States provides 22% of the regular budget for the United Nations. Or, as put down here, United States provided $9.7 billion of the United Nations 2016 budget. That is a lot of money. And what does that money go toward? Well, some of the activities that I mentioned here. The United Nations is involved in maintaining international peace and security. So there are basically United Nations military personnel is sometimes what these quote unquote peacekeeping is, where it is military personnel from a bunch of different UN countries, but they are technically fighting under the umbrella and under the authority of the United Nations. So you might have something like a bunch of US troops and a bunch of Irish troops and some German troops, and they're all fighting under a UK general who is taking orders from the United Nations, kind of a thing. And sometimes they accomplish some good stuff, but oftentimes you just run into problems because maybe, well, what if what the United Nations is trying to accomplish is not exactly on the same plane as what the United States goals are? And what kind of sticky situations do you run into when you have US troops being told to do stuff that is not really in keeping with US goals, but they have to do what they're being told under UN rules and yeah, stuff like that. Protect human rights. That can take a variety of shapes and forms. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's pro-abortion stuff, though it's not always stuff along that line. Sometimes it is helping to help refugees who are fleeing genocide in different countries. Deliver humanitarian aid, and then uphold international law. Uh, I'm not a huge fan of things like the United Nations, but there are some good things that happen. But oftentimes there's a lot of corruption, a lot of money that gets funneled in ways that are not good, and again, is largely based on a faulty premise. But there you go, a little bit about the United Nations. And along that line, video question number 5. Video question number 5. Antonio Guterres is the name of the guy who is the current Secretary General of the United Nations. So the person who's kind of at the head of the United Nations, not like in a getting to call the shots, but getting to set certain aspects of their agenda and helping to run certain aspects of their meetings. Anyway, Antonio Guterres, who is the current Secretary General of the United Nations, is from what country? And the answer is Portugal. Portugal. So the current Secretary General of the UN is Portuguese. All right, moving on. Communism spreads. So what we have here is we have the dark red is countries that turned communist at least by the 1920s. And yep, so you have a bit there. And then 1940s, So that was because of the end of World War II. Soviet Union was able to take control of a lot in Eastern Europe. And the 1950s, that mainly added Cuba there, it looks like. And a little bit, I think possibly Vietnam there. Yep, that's the third color up. And then 1960s, 1970s just start to have a um, little bit in Africa mainly, but a little bit more in Asia as well. And this is a picture of Joseph Stalin. So by this time, Joseph Stalin is the dictator in the Soviet Union. Um, in many ways, ruthless over people that disagreed with him, groups that he didn't care for, and responsible for a lot of deaths. But not as many as others, but we'll see a little bit about that later. Okay, next slide. So, one of the ways of combating the spread of communism, really, there were kind of two that come up here. A little bit about NATO and a little bit about the Marshall Plan. So, NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You have that here, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And so, as the name implies, is countries that are in the North Atlantic. So, we're talking, United States and Canada, with their eastern borders on the Atlantic Ocean, and then Western Europe with their western borders on the Atlantic Ocean in the North Atlantic. And the gist of it, kind of have that here. Well, first of all, founded 1949, and then the overarching goal or purpose was to defend each other from the threat of Soviet communist takeover. So it was kind of if the Soviet Union tries to take over any of us or tries to attack any of us, then the others will help defend and support each other. Okay? So, like Turkey, for example, if the United States, or sorry, if the Soviet Union tried to invade or tried to take Turkey, then because of being a member of NATO, then the other NATO countries would help defend Turkey to help contain the spread of communism. And then the Marshall Plan, named after the guy who was at one point, what was he, overall commander? Oh no, he was, I'm drawing a blank on the name of his position, but high up in the military, chief of staff. I think he was chief of staff of the military in World War II. And then later, by this time, he is the Secretary of State. And the the Marshall Plan, it was to help European countries recover from World War II, so that was part of it. It was, hey, let's give money and supplies to countries who are devastated by World War II and who are trying to recover from World War II. But then also, let's do that for the purpose of helping to strengthen them for defense against the spread of communism. And the idea was Eastern European countries will be less likely to fall to communism if their economies are strong and if they have a decently well equipped military. And so let's keep their economy strong, let's keep their military in good shape, and let's just help them get them back up on their feet. And because of that, they will be less likely to fall to communism. They will be less likely to be overtaken by the Soviet Union. And it was a thing that was going from 1948 to 1952, so about 4 years there. Okay, next slide. Uh, this is about the House Un-American Activities Committee, a little bit about McCarthyism, and a little bit about the Manhattan Project. And overall, one overarching thing here was called the Red Scare. The Red Scare was a response to communism in the United States. And one of the organizations involved with trying to combat the spread of communism or the promotion of communist ideas in the United States was the House Un-American Activities Committee, or like you can see here, the HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee. And this guy you can see has a sign that says free speech, not HUAC. And that was a point of contention at this time, is to what extent can the government try to halt the spread of ideas or even try to stop people from believing, thinking, or saying certain things if what they are believing, thinking, or saying is in line with the ideology of the enemy of the country. I think that's where some were coming from, like the members, the congressmen who were part of the HUAC, as they're like, we are at a war against communism. We are at war against the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. And we have to help make sure that communism does not spread to the United States. And a way of doing that is by trying to make sure that communists in the United States do not spread their ideas. And one of the famous things that they did is they created a what was called a Hollywood blacklist. At least is what it became known as. And in particular, there were the Hollywood 10 that were 10 mainly writers, but writers and directors that were either known to promote communist ideas or known to hold communist ideals. And the House took them to question them and basically said you must appear before this committee in order to be questioned about your communist ideas. And initially, all 10 of these well known writers and directors refused to cooperate, or at least some, if not all of them, did show up, but basically said, I'm not going to answer your questions. And one of the main things that the House Un American Activities Committee wanted is for communists to name names of other communists. And in a sense, it kind of became like the Salem witchcraft trials, where it just kind of became anyone could name anyone kind of a thing. And sometimes it's like a person who was innocent, who didn't hold, well, quote unquote innocent. I don't mean like, because to say innocent kind of implies that to hold communist ideas was guilty, but it's like, well, guilty of what? Um, But anyway, a person who was not a communist sometimes would be named by a person as being a communist. And so then they would be put on question of, and basically like cooperate with us and tell us the names of other communists, or your career is ended because you are going to be labeled as a communist and no one is going to hire you anymore. And so sometimes people in that situation would just name names of other people, even if they didn't know whether or not they were communists. So there's kind of a lot of that kind of stuff going on. There's an interesting movie that is somewhat based on that premise. It's The Truman Show. Jim Carrey is the main star in it. Tells the story of uh, a guy who went missing in World War II. Everyone supposed that he was dead, but suddenly he shows up and has amnesia, and he doesn't really know who he is. But long story short, it involves some accusations of being communist, and at one point the character has to decide, do I just go along with this and do I name names so I can have my career back, or do I say no, this isn't right? We have a First Amendment in the Constitution that says that people have the freedom of speech even if what they are speaking about is communism. And that was one of the big struggles that the main character had to go through, along with some other things. But anyway, I recommend it. I enjoyed it a lot. Some people I know didn't care for the movie that much, but I thought it was pretty good. So this picture up here is the House Un-American Activities Committee holding a hearing. And this is an example of some of the propaganda that would be used at the time. The Red Menace is real. Report all suspected communist activity. And to speak of the HUAC, let's do number one of your video questions. Video question number one. What movie by one of the Hollywood 10, again, that was the list of 10 well known directors and screenwriters who got blacklisted for being communist? Anyway, what movie by one of the Hollywood 10 won an Academy Award for Best Story? And the answer is Roman Holiday. Roman Holiday. It's an Aubrey Hepburn, Gregory Peck movie. Aubrey Hepburn is, I think, a princess who goes on a vacation in Rome, and she meets up with Gregory Peck. And yeah, anyway, it's about her time there in Rome. So, Roman Holiday. The name of the screenwriter was Dalton Trumbo, but at the time the movie came out, because he had been blacklisted, there was another screenwriter who was pretending to be the person who helped create the story and who helped write the screenplay. And many years after the fact, started to be well known that, oh, it actually wasn't this guy, it was Dalton Trumbo. And it was just, I think, in something like 2003 or something like that. So we're talking a good almost 50 years after the movie came out, that Dalton Trumbo officially started to receive recognition and started to receive the awards that attributed to his name, that technically, I mean, or at least practically speaking, he had won as the screenwriter and the creator of the story. All right, so that was number one, Roman Holiday. Uh, this picture here is Senator Joseph McCarthy. And he was another big name in trying to combat the spread of communist ideas in the United States. And the term that was attributed to him that had a specific meaning at his time, it has a more general meaning now, is McCarthyism. And McCarthyism is this kind of general idea of being assumed guilty by association, or being guilty because of certain beliefs that you apparently hold, and whether or not you're guilty of like actually committing any crimes, or so it's kind of like a guilt of ideas or a guilt of beliefs. Sometimes it is based on just people saying that you believe those things, and there not being much evidence to support that. So that was Joseph McCarthy. He was a senator again. And then this picture here, this is something having to do with the Manhattan Project. And it has what you see here, what you do here, what you hear here. When you leave here, let it stay here. Manhattan Project, super secret project involving the development of the atomic bomb during World War II. Manhattan Project was started largely because there was some evidence that the Germans were working on developing an atomic bomb. And it was the idea that you could release some of the energy that is holding the nucleus of an atom together by causing a disruption to the nucleus of the atom. And in particular, at the time, the type of atomic energy that they were releasing was nuclear fission, where you are breaking nuclei apart into smaller nuclei. And the result of that, and we get into this a little bit in physics, but the result of that is you release a tremendous amount of energy that was helping to hold the nucleus together. And there were a few places that actually didn't really take place in Manhattan, despite being called the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was called that because one of the initial buildings where some of the administrative work was being done for it was an office building in Manhattan. But most of the research was done a little bit in Tennessee, most of it at a facility called Los Alamos. And that's probably where, well, I don't know if that picture would be Los Alamos, because that doesn't look like the right terrain. So that might be Tennessee, but I'm not quite sure. But anyway, number four, video question number four. Los Alamos, the main site of the Manhattan Project, is in what state? And the answer is New Mexico. It was Los Alamos, New Mexico. And it must have been a hard decision to make sometimes, but sometimes what happened is a person would be like a professor of physics at some American university, and then someone would come to them and basically say, I have a job offer for you. I can't tell you what it is. I can't tell you where it is. I can give you a ballpark figure of how much money you'll make. I can tell you that you will be working with some of the best minds, and you will be doing something important for your country. Will you take the job? And that was what it was like sometimes. And these people had to decide, just based on that information, am I going to do this potentially life-altering thing and take this job? This picture here is Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And they were traitors who ended up being executed for treason, for passing secrets on to the Soviet Union. There were others as well, but they were one of the well-known, and they were involved with helping pass along some of the information to the Soviet Union about different schematics of different aspects of building an atomic bomb, and that helped the Soviet Union get to where they became a nuclear power referring to a country that has the ability to build and weaponize and have nuclear bombs. And it probably would have taken the Soviet Union a good decade longer to get to where they had atomic bombs if it weren't for different traders in the US who passed that information along to the Soviet Union. All right, so that was going on. But then we switch gears and talk a little bit about China, because China turning communist was another big thing that happened here and that affected some of the flow of history at this time. So what we have here is this is mainland China, and that says Peking there. Another way of spelling or pronouncing Peking that is more commonly used now is Beijing. What happens is Mandarin Chinese. There was an older system and now there's a newer system for how you take the way the word sounds in Chinese and how you try to represent the gist of the sound in with the American alphabet. And there was an older system would have it as Peking, the newer system has it as Beijing, and it's the same thing like with Mao Zedong's name. Now it's most commonly spelled Mao Zedong. At the time your textbook was written, it was more commonly spelled as Mao Zedong, so TSE hyphen TUNG, so Zedong, and now Zedong. Chiang Kai-shek, it has some also differences like that, but he's still commonly known just as Chiang Kai-shek. So Chiang Kai-shek had been the leader in China for a while, but then Mao Zedong started to gain some control over some groups and mainly some of the areas up around in here with communism. And George Marshall, the Secretary of State at the time, I think it was Secretary of State at the time, was sent to kind of help negotiate a little bit of peace between the Free Chinese under Chiang Kai shek and the communists who were trying to rebel and overthrow Chiang Kai shek's government. And your textbook points out that George Marshall's attempt to find a peaceful resolution between the groups allowed Mao Zedong's communists to gain strength enough that by the time George Marshall was done trying to negotiate peace, Mao Zedong's communists had too much strength for Chiang Kai shek's free Chinese military to conquer, and it opened the door for the communists to end up taking control of China. And so this is technically known now as the People's Republic of China. And it's one of the ironic things about a lot of countries that are run by dictators, and especially communist countries, is they like to go with very nice sounding names like the People's Republic of China. Kind of like North Korea is the. Oh, wait a second. Democratic Republic of Korea. I'd have to double check. That's not sounding right, but that's what was coming to mind. Anyway, so the People's Republic of China is the communist China. And then Chiang Kai shek and a group of people with him ended up fleeing to this island here called Taiwan. And that was where they established the country, the Republic of China. So sometimes it's abbreviated PRC. You might even see sometimes objects that were made in China that instead of saying made in China, they'll sometimes say made in PRC. I don't know if they're just trying to save a letter, because PRC is 3 letters versus, oh wait, save 2 letters, 1, 2, 3, yeah, 5 letters, 3 letters instead of 5. Or if they're like, just in case there are people who are reluctant to buy stuff that says made in China, we'll say made in PRC, and maybe people won't notice as well. And then Taiwan, sometimes also called the Republic of China or the ROC. And it is still considered, yeah, well, there's debate amongst countries about to what extent Taiwan should be considered a legitimate Chinese country. And communist China tries to pressure a lot of countries into not really giving legitimate recognition to Taiwan as a legitimate, Republic of China. And I know it's one thing that President Trump has spoken about a little bit, and different presidents in the recent past. I think, well, at least going back to Bill Clinton, that I can think of, would take a variety of stands, and to what extent they kind of capitulated to communist China because of how much stuff we buy from them, and trying to like get along with communist China and not offend communist China, and tiptoeing around whether or not they would refer to Taiwan as the Republic of China and view it as a legitimate country. Okay. Speaking of Taiwan, video question number 3. What U.S. state is closest in size to Taiwan? So, what U.S. state is closest in size to Taiwan? And the answer is Maryland. Maryland. Maryland is something like 12,000 some square miles, and Taiwan here is just under 14,000 square miles. So pretty close to being in size, the same size as the state of Maryland, which, if you look at a U.S. map, Maryland is a fairly small state. And then video question number 2 is, who killed more people, Adolf Hitler, Mao Zedong, or Joseph Stalin? And the answer is Mao Zedong. Um, it gets hard to decide what deaths to count and what deaths not to count, but if you count the Great Leap Forward, which the Great Leap Forward was an effort that Mao Zedong enacted that was to nationalize the farms in the country by like dictating to farmers all across the country how they grew their crops, how they went about, doing their farming, and then how they reported that. And the government would collect a bunch of stuff and would tax a bunch of stuff and things like that. And the result of the government mandating these things on farmers led to, most estimates have something in the range of 45 million Chinese people starving to death. And yeah, 45 million. Now you add to that the number of people that Mao Zedong directly killed because they were political enemies of his, or they were, and the death toll for Mao Zedong oftentimes is in the like 50 to 65 million range. It's just unfathomable how many people died under Mao Zedong. And I had a history professor one time who said that one of the distinct differences between Mao and Stalin is that Stalin didn't care about killing people, but he mainly just killed people when he felt it was necessary because they were political opponents of his, or because they were a group of people who were trying to revolt or something like that. Whereas there are a variety of evidence that Mao Zedong sometimes killed people just because he found pleasure in it. And there's just that level of sadism, of just, a sadistic nature of finding joy in other people's suffering and death sometimes. And that wraps up all of your video questions. There was one thing that when I started this PowerPoint, I was like, oh, that's right. There was that topic from your lecture questions or your reading questions that I didn't include anything about, and I'm drawing a blank on it right now. What that was. So I will double check, maybe include one extra little topic in the next video, but for right now, that wraps it up, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of a perspective of some of the maps of where we are, some of the faces of what these people look like, and just a little bit more about what was going on at this time. Okay, I'll see you next time.